Welcome to SLP Nerdcast. I'm Kate.
And I'm Amy, and we appreciate you tuning in. In our podcast, we review and provide commentary on resources, literature, and we discuss issues related to the field of speech-language pathology.
You can use this podcast for ASHA CEUs. For more information about us and certification maintenance hours or CEUs, go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. SLP Nerdcast is brought to you in part by listeners like you. You can support our work by going to our website or social media pages and contributing. Even the smallest amount counts and helps us keep our podcast ad-free. You can also find permanent products, notes, and other handouts on our website, including a handout for this episode. Some items are free, others are not, but everything is always affordable. Go to our website to submit a call for papers to come on the show and present with us, or contact us anytime on Facebook, Instagram, or at info@slpnerdcast.com. We love hearing from our listeners, and we can't wait to learn what you have to teach us.
And just a quick disclaimer. The contents of this episode are not meant to replace clinical advice. SLP Nerdcast, its hosts and guests do not represent or endorse specific products or procedures mentioned during our episodes unless otherwise stated. We are not PhDs, but we do research our material. We do our best to provide a thorough review and a fair representation of each topic that we tackle. With that being said, it's always likely that there's an article that we've missed or another perspective that we haven't shared. If you have something to add to the conversation, please do email us. We love to hear from you.
And in the interest of getting the boring stuff over with as quickly as possible, quick housekeeping issue or thing, financial and non-financial disclosures. Kate's financial disclosures, that's me. I'm the owner and founder of Grand Bois Therapy and Consulting, and I'm co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. My non-financial disclosures, I'm a member of ASHA SIG 12, and I serve on the AAC advisory group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I'm also a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy, Mass ABA, the Association for Behavior Analysis International, and the corresponding Speech Pathology and Applied Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group.
Amy, that's me. I'm an employee of a public school system and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. And my non-financial disclosures, I am a member of ASHA SIG 12, and I also serve on the AAC advisory group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children.
That was record time. We ran through that so fast this time. Air five. Good job. So what are we talking about today?
So super excited about today. Today is the second installment on our series about AAC evaluations.
We chose this topic because, first and foremost, I guess this is also part of our disclosures. Amy and I are both employed as, quote, AAC specialists. That's in air quotes. So this is definitely within our scope of competence. And we've had a bunch of people write in to learn more about AAC evals. And as we covered in our first episode on AAC evaluations, AAC evals are significantly different from the standard speech and language evaluation that we do as clinicians. They're different in a lot of ways. If you're new to the world of AAC evaluations, we definitely recommend that you go back and listen to that first episode to get a feel for the foundational knowledge. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today is building on that foundational knowledge. If you've already listened to that episode, or you feel you already have a good understanding of the foundational knowledge that goes into AAC assessments, then this is the episode for you. Today, we are going to focus on the skills involved in actually conducting the AAC assessment itself. So let's paint a picture real quick. You're working in a clinic, you've done your continuing education, and you've sought out your additional learning experiences to make sure that conducting AAC evaluations is within your scope of competence, because let's remember, we're speech pathologists. Our scope of practice is very, very, very wide. And just because something is in your scope of practice does not mean that it's within your scope of competence. So in this little picture that we're painting, you've gone through those exercises and you feel that doing AAC assessments is within your scope of competence. Maybe you found a mentor, maybe you already had one, but you have someone to ask questions along the way, you feel pretty supported, and now the time has come, you are ready to do your first AAC assessment. You're actually going to do it. Where do you start? What do you do? Today, we're going to go over some things that you need to consider in beginning to embark on that evaluation process, and some things to think about when you're in the position for that or on the brink of that evaluation beginning. We're going to try and help you answer the question, what do you actually do in an AAC assessment? Our learning objectives for the day: learning objective number 1, define feature matching and describe its role in the AAC assessment process. Learning objective number 2, identify at least 3 components of a comprehensive AAC assessment. And learning objective number 3, identify at least 3 client considerations when conducting a comprehensive AAC assessment. So I should also say one last quick plug. This is going to be a series. We are going to do at least 2 more on this that are related to funding and documentation. Hopefully one on evaluations for specific populations. So stay tuned for all those things today. We are just really going to go through the nuts and bolts of how to do that, what things to consider in this assessment. So let's get going. Let's get started. Learning objective number 1. Define feature matching and describe its role in the AAC assessment process. Let's set the stage. You're getting ready to conduct your first AAC evaluation, which means you're actually going to welcome your first client into the treatment room. You're going to sit in the chair. You're going to do the work. I say sit in the chair. Sometimes that means running around in the classroom. Sometimes that means running around in your clinic. Could mean a lot of different things. Rolling around on the floor could mean a whole bunch of different things depending on the client that you see.
You will literally or metaphorically sit in the chair.
Yes, exactly. So that means that you're in your AAC assessment mindset. And this is where we're going to do just a really quick review from our first episode. To be in that mindset, you have to acknowledge and understand that this process is more time intensive than your typical 3-year assessment or your typical speech and language assessment. You've considered the importance of the assessment in terms of the fact that it gives an individual access to their basic human right to communicate. You acknowledge that as the AAC evaluator, your role is not to be a decider. Now, I cannot say this enough, and I have to repeat this a lot to my mentees. When you are an AAC evaluator, you don't get to just show up and then decide what the best tool is and stomp on everybody else's feelings and just tell them what to do. That's not your job.
Which to just share a little like personal embarrassing factoid. Like I used to think that was my job.
I think I did that until I don't want to say recently. It's been a little while, but that was definitely me as an AAC evaluator when I started.
And I think so for anybody who's listening, who this might be a bit of a shift for you, that's okay. I think, we talk a lot on this show about how we're all always learning. And while you may have the name expert or specialist attached to your job title, that doesn't mean that you know everything, because as we know that's impossible. I think that's something that has really shifted my practice quite a bit, has been the awareness of this really important component that you really are the facilitator and you are not the dictator of the system.
Exactly. So to say that again, as the AAC evaluator, your role is not the decider, you are the facilitator. That's a critical and very important keyword. And you acknowledge the importance of considering the client, considering the caregiver perspectives, considering the caregiver values, family values, other stakeholders for the individual, and you're facilitating a decision that supports different perspectives. You acknowledge the value of conducting AAC assessments as an interdisciplinary team when possible. That is also a really important component. Another perspective that's really important in your AAC assessment mindset is that you're familiar with the 4 domains of communicative competence that were outlined by the seminal article by Light in 1989. We're not going to go through that in detail here. You can review our previous episode on AAC assessment. And I think we went through it in our AAC Basics series in 1 and 2. So we've definitely gone over that before. We're not going to do it in detail today. But for the sake of recapping, those 4 domains of communicative competence are operational, linguistic, social, and strategic. All right. So we've got our AAC evaluator hats on, our mindset on. We're facilitators. We're interdisciplinary when possible. It's going to be a lot more work than our regular 3 years. Now, what do? We can't talk about where to begin with an AAC assessment unless you understand the feature matching process, which is essentially the whole point of an AAC evaluation. And I thought it would be a good idea to start by defining that. So feature matching refers to the overall process of matching an individual's linguistic, motoric, social, functional, and communicative needs to the features of a product, device, or tool. So in my mind, I have this little picture in my mind where there's two cabinets. There's a cabinet on the left and there's a cabinet. Are you laughing at me? And there's a cabinet and there's a cabinet on the right. She's laughing at me. She's muted.
I like visuals. It's good.
Right? So in your cabinet on the left, you have everything that you learn about your client. And in the cabinet on the right, you have every tool, product, and communication enhancement feature ever in existence known to man. And you are intimately familiar with both items in the cabinet, and you get to pick one out of each cabinet and match them. That's how I think of it.
Oh, that's interesting. I have like a slightly different visual.
Tell me your visual.
So I guess we could extend the cabinet idea, but for me, that cabinet has a few different parts to it. So there's the cabinet that has a shelf or two that tell me about my client's receptive and expressive language skills, their functional use of language. And then I have cabinets, then I have like shelves in that cabinet, and we'll talk more about this later, that kind of talk about the environmental variables,
yes,
about the communication partners. And then kind of out of that cabinet comes a bunch of different priorities, right? So we've got a bunch of different priorities, and we're trying to look in your devices and strategies cabinet and find out which ones match our priorities the best way.
Yes, I like that.
Because you'll never have a perfect match.
Right. And we're going to talk about that more later on.
Yeah.
I think, right? We're going to talk about that more later on about how nothing's ever perfect. Okay.
Hang
in. Stick with us. We'll get there. Okay, so you have your cabinets or whatever visual you need to use that sort of help you at least hopefully understand the core components of the feature matching process. Feature matching is something that's done that essentially matches the needs of an individual with both aided and unaided tools. If you're unfamiliar with the difference between aided and unaided tools, we're not going to go through that here either, but we refer you to our first episode on AAC basics where we unpack that a little bit more. So there are two authors that we both have the pleasure of knowing because they're here with us in Boston, Howard Shane and John Costello. Hi, guys. If you're listening, which I'm sure you're not because you're fancy and have better things to do than listen to our podcast. But anyway, so I think they pioneered this idea. When I went into the literature, one of the first references to feature matching I could find was from an article or something that they wrote in 1994. And they wrote another article that's definitely worth checking out. It was published by Shane, Costello, and Gosnell. And the title of the article is Using a Clinical Approach to Answer, quote, what communication apps should we use? And we'll have that reference in the show notes. There's a quote from this article on page 88 that I want to read, which is as follows. Selecting the most appropriate AAC system, including hardware, software, and intervention strategies, is the result of a systematic process by which a person's strengths, abilities, and needs, current and future, are matched to available tools and strategies. This is a process often referred to as feature matching. So they actually cited themselves in this article. They cited their original work from 1994. Where they sort of laid the foundation for this description. And if we'll have both of the articles listed in our show notes, if you would like to go back and look at them. The original description from the 1994 article is as follows. Feature matching is a framework for clinical decision-making based on a set of rules and pertinent questions for selecting AAC tools and strategies rather than guesswork, media coverage, public testimonials, or recommendations from well-meaning friends and family. And I think that is huge because so much of what we see, especially now with social media, is, hey, try this tool, try that tool, do this. I saw the 60 Minutes episode on Proloquo Go. You should just use that. My son, daughter, cousin, friend has a really great time with this app. You should try it. That's not how the evaluation process works. It's a systematic and procedural process through which, and again, I'm just going to refer to this description, a set of rules and pertinent questions that you use to select AA tools and strategies.
Well, and I think it's helpful to kind of place that article in time too, because I remember like right around 2011, 2012 was when all of this became a thing.
When we started being friends.
We were friends before that.
Just teasing you.
But perhaps we bonded over, the kind of the explosion around, using tablets and like consumer technology. So
Right.
I think this article was also a response to sort of the paradigm shift, which previously had really been more of SLP, AAC, specialist, air quotes, practitioner as like gatekeeper. And so when
Right.
the availability of all of these like consumer products kind of burst onto the scene, it flipped that paradigm upside down.
Oh my gosh, that was wild time to be alive, Amy. The whole field flipped on its head. We could talk about that for like a whole hour. I think you make such a good point in terms of when that shifted and how the importance of the feature matching process really became that much more important as people had more access to information and products.
I do think a really cool thing that came from that though was, and maybe this is just how it aligned in my like professional education and trajectory as a clinician, but was like it also kind of dismantled some of that I'm the expert, I'm prescribing my expert thing.
Yes.
Right. And
that's very, very true.
I feel like for a lot of people, more dynamic, more accessible. A lot of these supports are like, especially when we're thinking about tablets, they're not so super special and scary because most of us carry small computers in our pockets and call them phones. You know what I mean? So it's the field has really come a long way. And I think we were at this one end, prior to the advent of all this tablet technology. And then we sort of did an upside down. And now we're somewhere like, I think more in the middle, which I think is great.
And I think another thing that's important to really pay attention to here in terms of, our learning objective and feature matching is that these fads still happen. So there are, I don't know, hundreds of communication apps out there, and a new one will get published, or one will get new features, or one will get a makeover. And we see it around here in our area. We call it the tool du jour. It's, it's the exciting new tool that everybody is exploring and everybody is using. And it still happens. And I think as clinicians, if you're getting ready to embark on your AAC evaluation journey, it's really critical to know that the feature matching process is not listening to advice or guesswork. It is a systematic process. And again, I'm referring to this 1994 description based on a set of rules and pertinent questions that help you select a tool and strategies rather than guesswork and all of those things. And I think, there's, like I said, there are so many great tools out there, but the best software and hardware strategy set of materials is useless if it's not well matched to the individual. And I see this all the time, and I'm sure you've seen it too. People will come to you for an AAC evaluation and they already have a tool. It's just not working for them for a million and one reasons. Maybe it's not the tool's fault. Maybe it's the teaching procedure's fault. But what I'm saying is it's when you're an AAC evaluator, you're not always evaluating somebody who doesn't have a tool. And understanding that feature matching process is really critical to successful AAC use.
Just to recap, the feature matching process itself is really the gathering of information about your client, including and extending to their various environments and communication partners, hopefully informed by multiple stakeholders, and kind of using that to identify your priorities and mapping that information onto what to be available in terms of aided and unaided supports, and whether those are specific items or strategies, probably a combination of multiple things. The feature matching is really talking about that process.
Right. And I think in order to embrace that, you have to know how to apply that process well. And how do you do that? I think that's a completely valid question. And this is where we start getting into the actual procedure of conducting the assessment in learning objective number 2. But to lay the groundwork for that, so generally speaking, you're going to need to know everything about your client, about your client that you can. You're going to need to know about their current status, communication status, medical status, the skills that they have, the skills that you would like them to acquire. All of those things about your client, you will learn through your comprehensive assessment, which we will talk about. You need to know about your client or student's communication environment and the different needs in those environments. You're going to need knowledge of the different tasks that your student needs to complete in those different environments, because things will change from environment to environment. And you need to know the knowledge of products, strategies, vendors, materials, interventions, or protocols that might come with those products and strategies. So again, you have to fill your client cabinet and you have to fill your product cabinet. You have to have knowledge of all of those different things in order to actually do the feature matching process well. And we should also say that knowledge of the different kinds of materials and strategies isn't just about the vendor and how much it weighs and how much it costs. You also have to know the benefits and the drawbacks of different categories or materials. So, for example, what is the plus and minus to having a high-tech tool versus a light-tech tool? If you need refreshers on all of those pluses and minuses and the different pluses and drawbacks to different kinds of tools, again, we refer you back to our AAC Basics courses. They're episodes. There's 2 of them. Go check them out if you haven't already. We go through a lot of those pieces in those episodes. Another set of knowledge that you need that's slightly ancillary, but you do have to have it in your knowledge set to be able to conduct a thorough assessment. At some point in the process, you need to consider the funding and you need to consider required documentation. We are not going to get into those 2 things today because that's a whole episode in and of itself. We will tackle that later on in the series, but that's another bucket of knowledge that you need.
So you need to know a lot of information about your client. And just to contrast this again with maybe your typical speech and language evaluation, whether you are kind of in an outpatient setting or maybe you're in a school setting, often what you're doing with that speech and language assessment is you're, at least in part, determining eligibility. Here, I feel like the lens is different. When we're looking at AAC, you're really looking at providing some type of bridge to help accommodate for barriers that are existing, right? So we see, communication challenges, perhaps in different environments. And back to that feature matching, you're trying to help identify which items or strategies or combination of items and strategies will help kind of mitigate those barriers in different environments. And that is sort of a different lens. This is almost like a super speech and language evaluation, because you still need that is sort of core information about your client. What types of communication are they currently using, with what levels of supports, what does kind of the intelligibility look like? But then you're layering this whole other piece on top of that. And I think that is part of the big contrast there with just more of a straightforward speech and language evaluation.
And just for the sake of saying it, this is a lot.
Yeah.
This is a lot of knowledge. And in my mentoring work, in terms of teaching people how to do these kinds of assessments, it is very overwhelming. I get that feedback a lot, that it's very overwhelming to sort of see all of the landscape of all the different things you need to know in order to do these kinds of assessments well. And one thing that has definitely I think really helps is learning about different kinds of frameworks out there to help you organize this kind of knowledge. So we've used this analogy a couple of times about these cabinets, and Amy's cabinet has different shelves.
I like how I was like, our cabinets are so different, but they're just cabinets.
I was waiting for you to be like, there's drawers in there, there's like different, but trying to find a way to help you organize this knowledge so that when you go through the evaluation process, you can systematically ask the questions and uncover different things in a more organized way. We're very biased in terms of loving the SET framework. In case anybody knows us, they know that already. We had the pleasure of interviewing the creator of the SET framework, Joy Zabala, on our episode, and we have an episode published all about it, and we definitely recommend going to check it out.
It's awesome. So if you're listening, the SET framework is an acronym. SETT stands for Student, Environment, Task, and Tools. And it really does help, I think, broaden your view of all, for me anyway, it helped broaden my view of all the things that I should really be considering in doing an AAC assessment. I think, having worked early on in my career, I worked a lot in outpatient. And I think sometimes what happens is you see such a small slice of of your client, that maybe we don't have the best concept of how important things like what the environment looks like and the different environments that the person is going to move through in the course of their day, and the different tasks or, kind of communication demands and things that facilitate or inhibit successful communication in those different environments. I think that the set framework for me was kind of like, it was that like little emoji guy whose, brain is exploding. Like that, those are my feelings about this framework as an evaluator.
In a happy way.
In a happy way, in a wonderful way, but in a way that like also does kind of up, like Kate was saying, it kind of ups the responsibility and bigness of the assessment. I think it feels more comfortable to make an AAC assessment be this very narrow thing where I look at your receptive and expressive language skills, and in my treatment room or whatever, my like kind of sterile single environment, I look at your motor skills, your visual skills, your hearing, all of these different things, and I use that to like make my list of features and pick the thing. I think that the problem with that, or what we miss when we apply that way of thinking about the process, is we miss all of these other really important variables that we should consider that do make the process a bit more complex, and it makes it usually take a little bit longer. But the set framework helps make that bigness feel doable.
Totally. I find when you introduced me to the set framework, I was like, oh, this makes so much sense. It creates different buckets for all the different knowledge that you need to acquire throughout the evaluation process. And for me, it wasn't just the expanding of it, or looking at it through a wider lens. It was organizing it and making it seem a little bit more doable. There's also another framework, just for the sake of mentioning it, called the PESICO framework, PESICO. That is geared more towards a medical model, I believe. And we can find a reference for that. We can put some information about the PESICO framework in case anyone would like to learn more about it. But anyway, in terms of, just to recap again, you've got your AAC evaluator hat on. You know that you're there to be a facilitator and not a decider. You've got your client or student scheduled in a week or two, and you're preparing for the assessment. Knowing what you need to know, you have the whole assessment process. You're going to need to learn a lot of different things. You're going to need to learn a lot of different things about your client, including their current status, the skills that they currently have, the skills that they need to have, the environments that they communicate in, the different tasks in those different environments. Ready? Student, environment, task, tool, right? Tool comes last. Then you need to know what tools are available, all of the things in your vendor cabinet. If you don't have a lot of tool knowledge or knowledge of products, go to a conference and cruise that vendor hall. Make contacts with your regional vendors. Do a good stalk on their web pages. Go through their product catalog. I think, the vendors are also, talking to the vendors themselves. Most of them will come and give in-person trainings. That's another really, really great place to start.
There are also a number of companies that do, free or, paid professional development opportunities through their website. So there's a lot of kind of item specific training to be had out there.
And don't be shy. Go there. They are there for you. They are there to educate you on their product. Okay. So we have the lay of the land. You're going into this assessment. You're going to get all the information about your clients, and you have all the information about different products and teaching procedures and all those kinds of things. You know what the feature matching process is, and you're going to be the best AAC facilitator there ever was and work in an intercollaborative way or interdisciplinary way. Let's move on to learning objective number 2. Identify at least 3 components of a comprehensive AAC assessment. So as we've mentioned several times, as the role of AAC evaluator, you play this facilitator role, and it makes sense that in order to do that, you're going to be not only collecting all of this information, but helping to facilitate a decision that aligns with the perspectives and the value systems of your client. Let's talk about what steps are best practice in going about this facilitative process. Like most assessments that you've that you do, you're going to conduct an interview. The interview is a critical piece of the AAC evaluation process. And I think for me, this is something that stands out a little bit from other evaluation models. We've already written some episodes on regular speech and language assessments and how we as a field tend to overuse standardized assessments and underuse other informal measures like the interview. But there really aren't a lot of standardized tests for AAC evals. That's not what we do in an AAC assessment. So the interview really comes front and center, at least for me, as a critical piece of this process. It's so critical that I don't think you can do an AAC evaluation with a thorough AAC evaluation without the interview component. The interview allows you to collect all of these different buckets of information about your client. We're going to use the SET framework here to help our listeners keep it organized. Student, environment, and tasks. You can conduct an interview to help you get the lay of the land across all of these different things. The interview is usually conducted first because what you learn in the interview is going to drive what other decisions you make throughout the rest of the assessment. So through this interview, you can learn about first student, their communications. I'm just using the acronym again to keep everybody organized. Student, environment, task, and tool. So S for student, you're going to learn about their communication status, receptive and expressive language skills. You're going to learn about their AAC history. What tools have they tried and when? What success did they have with those tools? Did they succeed? Did they fail? And why? Iconicity. It's a big fancy word. We're not going to go into the definition of it. If you aren't familiar with iconicity, go back to our AAC Basics episode and check it out where we talk about that. But essentially in that interview, you're going to learn what kinds of symbols do they have a history of using? Were they a failure or were they a success and why?
I think just a quick note about iconicity, if you are thinking about icons, just to make it clear, there's not a set hierarchy. So it's not like when we think about iconicity, it's not like you have to move through understanding objects before you can move to pictures. There are a lot of different components that go into whether an icon system is going to be a good fit for your client or not. But just to put that out, because sometimes people get confused and they think like, you can't see my air quotes, but you're at the object level. So we need to be just using objects.
Right. So again, you can see how completely critical this interview is in terms of getting all of this history. What's the individual's medical status or medical history? Have they had a recent change in their medical status, or is their medical status stable? What is their communication status overall outside of receptive and expressive language skills? What about their speech status? A lot of our AAC users are multimodal communicators. When is their speech successful and when is it not? What communication strategies have been successful or unsuccessful in promoting speech or the successful use of speech? What is their literacy status? That is a huge component in terms of which tool you're going to pull out of your tool cabinet. Which shelf are you going to reach onto when you're thinking about literacy and receptive and expressive language skills? What is the individual sensory and motor status? What is their behavioral status? What communication needs and different tasks does the student or client need to complete in those different environments? So are they in a vocational program where they have a job setting and the communication requirements are different there than they are at school versus a school setting versus the home setting versus being out and about in the community or visiting families' houses? What are the different environments that are relevant to the student? Who are the communication partners and what is their value system? What are the communication partners' goals and wishes for the assessment? These are so important. And I know I literally just read a long list, and I'm sure if you have never done an AAC assessment before and you are listening to this because you'd like to, we have a handout that has this long list on it. So don't feel like you have to remember all of these things because it is a lot. Okay, so you've done your interview, but now maybe you're wondering if you interviewed the right person.
And I think one piece that goes along with the interview before we get into who exactly you're getting this information from, I would lump in this same category, sort of a record review. So some of this information you're going to get through a thorough record review. Let's say that you are, an outpatient provider, you're conducting an assessment. Maybe you can't interview everybody, and we'll find out just who everybody is. Stay tuned. But you might be able to read the most current IEP or something like that.
Right.
So think about multiple sources, both people who you speak with and things that you might be able to get through reading reports and other records.
And we're going to talk about that in a second in terms of one of the massive problems with the interview is time. So quickly, just for the sake of listing at things, if you had unlimited time, who could you interview and who should you consider interviewing? Obviously, family, caregivers, direct communication partners, educational team, other staff who may work with the student, therapeutic teams, medical teams, if you have access to them, any other primary stakeholder or communication partner in the environment. So that's also a long list. Let's talk about time for a second. This is a massive, massive undertaking, this interview, and likely you'll have time to do some interview, some in-person interview, even if you're in we've done AAC evaluations in an outpatient setting where it's like, they want you in and out. You have an hour and a half to do that assessment. Usually you will have some time allocated for an in-person interview. If you don't, advocate with your administration to get some time built into your schedule for this, because it is such a critical component. If you don't have time, brainstorm other ways to get this information about your student or client. Send emails, send handouts or questionnaires as permanent product. Engage in we're in the age of technology. We're recording this in a pandemic. Everybody Zooms now, right? Before that was like super weird. You'd say, hey, you want to Zoom with me? They'd be like, what are you talking about? Embrace these asynchronous and synchronous telecommunication modalities that we're now also familiar with. So again, just to recap, the interview is a really critical component and something that you need to do first to help guide your clinical decision-making in terms of what you're going to do moving forward. All right. So let's say you finished your interview. What do you do next? Or you're planning to do your interview. You have a good interview lined up. And I had in my mentee, shout out if you're listening, ask me recently, what interview form do you use? And I became very embarrassed because I don't have an interview form. I was very informal with my interviews. So there's really no right or wrong way to do this. There are some formal interview questions that some people use. Amy, I think you have a form that you use. But however you get this information, I think is okay, as long as you're really considering all of the different buckets.
I totally agree. I have a form because I have a distracted mind. And so my form, what it helps me do is make sure that I'm asking all of the different questions that I want to ask, because even though I've done this for a while, I still forget. And sometimes you get into a conversation with any of the stakeholders and it kind of brings you in a different direction, which is wonderful. And you get some good information in that direction. But then when I sit down to write my report, I realize, oh no, I never asked these other questions that I really need to know the answer to, because we went in this other direction, which was great. So I find that for me, writing down kind of all of the key questions that I want to ask helps make sure that I just get those questions answered. And it's like more of an organizational tool. I think the only other piece, just having, like, we both worked in a lot of different types of work environments. I think if you are in an environment where you can't gain access to more stakeholders, let's say we are like zoom back in time, way back in the day when we first met, we're in our time machine, we're working outpatient. For me, it was like an afternoon evening job. And so my availability was not during the school day. I had a lot of trouble trying to connect with school team members for, clients who I was seeing in the after school hours. Sometimes just making a note of that in your assessment, at least saying, I was able to review the IEP, but all of these things should be considered by the people who are in this environment. And maybe even putting some questions in your report that you hope the team will ask themselves in the future, because the work, we've talked about this a lot, but the work environment, time limits what we're able to do.
It really, really does. But I think if you take nothing away from this episode, take away that it's important and you should do your best within the restrictions that you have to collect this information and conduct said interview or permanent product or email correspondence or whatever it is. All right. Once you've conducted your interview and done a fabulous job, consider the importance of doing an observation, a direct student or client observation.
And I think when you're doing an observation, it can help you to clarify some things that may be questions in your mind that popped up during the observation. So during the interview. So when you're doing your interview, you'll probably be asking questions and find that some of your questions people answer right away and they have the answer. Some of the questions that you ask might lead to some dialogue and like refinement. And then some of the questions you're going to ask, people might not know the answer to. So I personally, I tend to like make a little flag there that those are things that I'm hoping to gather through observation, right? So I might want to know a little bit about, exactly what the person, I think things that pop up specifically often tend to be more tied to those tasks within certain environments. So people may know, oh, I know a lot about how this person communicates at home with mom. I know how they communicate in my speech and language session, but maybe we don't know that much about what communication looks like in a big group opportunity in the general education classroom, right?
Right.
So that might be a time that either you're going to do a direct observation, or maybe you flag that as something for like further interview. Maybe you want to have a different interview with somebody else and gather that information if you can't coordinate that observation. But observations can yield a lot of really helpful information.
I agree. And I also think that just given the time that we live in, again, embracing telecommunication, even if you are in an outpatient setting conducting this assessment outside of the AAC user's functional environment, you can ask for asynchronous videos. You can do observation in a lot of creative ways without, driving to the individual's school or home and sitting in their living room or standing in the corner of the classroom. Really getting that eyes-on experience for the AAC user can be incredibly helpful. Let's talk about standardized or criterion referenced assessments, because I think that this is something that people assume is part of an AAC assessment sometimes, but not necessarily. And again, I already mentioned this is a big difference from the traditional speech and language assessments. While there are some standardized assessment tools available, I am pretty sure, this might be my opinion and not a fact, but it is not standard practice to use them. And you can conduct a thorough AAC assessment without using a standardized tool.
I would agree.
Yes, I love it when you agree with me. It makes me, you'd think our listeners probably think that we like don't talk before these things. So if you have one of these standardized tools available to you, you can feel free to use them. You can also feel free to use them in a non-standardized fashion to collect information. One that I use a lot is I keep saying standardized. That doesn't necessarily mean norm referenced. If you need a refresher on that, go listen to our episodes on comprehensive speech and language assessments. The first is the TASP, which is the Test of Aided Communication Symbol Performance. One is the DAG, DAGG, which stands for the Dynamic AAC Goals Grid. The AACP, which is the Augmentative Alternative Communication Profile. The communication matrix, which is one that I use a lot. And just as a total bias, if you don't know the communication matrix, you need to go learn about it because it's a great tool for complex communication needs. AAC, just in general. The AAC Genie, which is an app, and the CSI-CY.
Yes, which is a variation of the ICF, which is developed through the WHO. And then
that was like a million acronyms. Can you tell me what those acronyms are? The CSI-CY from the ICF from the HOW.
So the CSI-CY is a tool that you can download for free online. And Oregon, the Health and Science University, in conjunction with Charity Rowland, Melanie Friedoken, Sandra Steiner, and Dawn Lawler, they work together, I think through the LEND grant, to kind of modify this tool that the WHO, so the World Health Organization, uses to kind of look at all sorts of barriers. And they looked specifically at communication for children and youth. That's what the CY stands for. So it kind of serves as a really nice way, again, just to organize some of those features and barriers, and thinking about barriers and facilitators in different contexts. So it's a pretty cool tool where you can go through and it's sort of a checklist, and you can kind of identify kind of where the barriers are with all of these different types of tasks. And then they've got this cool column at the end where you can identify sort of what your priorities are, because although you may have a client who has barriers in a lot of areas, we obviously know, like, we've got to pick some key ones to work on. If you make everything a priority, nothing really gets its fair share of focus.
So if you have these tools available to you, feel free to use them. You do not have to use them. It is not the norm or necessary to use them. And again, most of them are standardized. That does not necessarily mean norm reference. Some of them are criterion reference, but you can do your digging and do your research and figuring out which one of those may or may not support your AAC assessment.
And then some of those are just tools that might be helpful. Like the AAC Genie, I don't think is norm or criterion reference, but it's just a tool that you might find helpful in kind of
a more structured tool.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've planned for your interview. You've considered the role of a more formal, structured, norm reference, criterion referenced assessment. Consider the conceptual frameworks that we've already discussed to organize and synthesize the information that you're collecting. The SEP framework and the PESICO framework are the two that come to that we reference most often. And then there are a bunch of other, I call them theoretical frameworks, that I think are really, really important to consider before you move forward with the assessment. So again, let's paint that picture. You've got your student or your client scheduled in a week or two. You're planning for the assessment. You've got your interview. You know what standardized or structured assessments you have available to you. You've become familiar with one of these conceptual frameworks, the SEP framework or the PESICO framework, to help you organize and synthesize your information. Now you're going to start thinking about, well, what do I actually do? What am I going to do when this, individual shows up at my clinic and shows up at my doorstep? There are some theoretical underpinnings that I think are really critical to help guide your decision-making and guide your choices. Number one, you always want to choose a tool that an individual can grow into. If the tool that you choose only meets the individual's needs now, but not in a year from now, then you're going to be doing this again in a year from now, and then a year after that, and a year after that. You always have to consider not just where your client is now, but where they're going to be.
And I think that this is a part that harkens back to that second cabinet, right? This is part of why it's helpful to know what different products are available to you and knowing a bit about those products, because oftentimes, particularly when we're thinking about high-tech aided tools, so that's like a high-tech device, it's external to your body, there are often a lot of ability to modify and customize those tools. So you might be able to, within a tool, customize it so that it meets the person's current needs, and with very little change, or without like a big rigmarole, you can just change some of those modifications and it becomes a more robust system that they're able to grow into.
I totally agree. I just think it's really important to keep that in the back of your mind as you're thinking about what your next steps are going to be. Okay, so that was guiding principle number one. Maybe we'll call them guiding principles. I don't know. I'm naming these things off the fly here. Number two, you want to choose a tool that allows for access to language without a lot of effort. You want to make sure you're removing that barrier. So AAC is this extra thing, right? You don't want it to be burdensome. You don't want it to be work. You want it to be low response effort. That is going to lend itself to fluency of use, and it's going to allow for consistent and independent access to language, which is what we want for our AAC users.
And it is also common sense, right? Like if somebody presents you with a new task that you're expected to do, which is, what we're essentially doing, we're saying, oh, here's this new thing. Then you're most likely to do the thing that is easiest, because we're all going to choose the thing that is easiest.
Exactly.
So yes, for all case reasons, but also just common sense.
Exactly. And you want independent access. So you don't want to choose a tool that the user is required to be prompted through consistently, because that's not independent language. So I remember one of the first AAC conferences that I went to, I heard this cute little acronym, SNUG, SNUG. You want spontaneous novel utterance generation for AAC users. You are, and again, this is harking back to that AAC evaluator hat that you have on. This is access. You're facilitating a decision that's going to give an individual access to their basic human right to independently communicate and have access to SNUG, spontaneous novel utterance generation, is a critical component to that. You don't want to be you can't put words in someone else's mouth or constantly prompt them through something. That's not doing your job.
Right. And another way to think about snug, other than being cozy and lovely, is to be able to say exactly what you want to say when you want to say it. So whatever tools or products we're looking at, strategies we're looking at, that's kind of the overriding principle, is being able to have autonomous communication.
Exactly. Okay. So we've reviewed a lot of these guiding principles. There's one more. It needs to be customizable. So all individuals are going to need customizations. Your people's food preferences are going to change. The activities that they like are going to change. People grow and change. That's just common sense. So you want to choose something that is highly customizable, not only to the individual's needs now, but for what they may need in the future. This is especially true for individuals with complex communication needs. And I think somebody said this to me once, and it really struck a chord with me, is that it's off label. A lot of things, what we do are, when you take that device out of the box, it is not a perfect fit. We're going to need to change it, and that's okay. So when you're going through this exercise in your mind and you're collecting all this information about your client or student and thinking about all the things in the toolbox, all the things in the product cabinet, you have to be okay with whatever you pull out isn't going to necessarily be perfect right away. It's going to need customizations and personalized changes to be able to match, again, that feature matching, to be able to match the needs of the user.
And not to overly complicate it too much, but often anybody who's a frequent listener here knows that I feel strongly that it's an AAC system. It's not just this one thing. So often what you might find through your interviews and gathering all of your information is that there may be different supports, different facilitators that are a better fit for different environments, and that's okay too. So that can also be in the back of your mind. You may have, certain things that you want to try to allow access to, a robust environment in the context of academics, but have other strategies and supports in place for different times and different types of messages.
Exactly. And that's a great segue into different functions. Is that sort of what you were getting at? Was the different functions?
Yeah, Mabel had something to add about that.
Does Mabel have something to say about about communicative functions? But that's another principle, is making sure that you are choosing something where the individual can communicate for multiple functions if possible. And I think, there is a plus and a minus to everything. And, you're, like Amy so brilliantly said earlier in this episode, she's making a face at me, when you open that cabinet and you're looking at all of the client's needs, you need to prioritize them. And you need to make the best fit based on the priorities and needs of the individual. So you might not be able to tick every single box in this list. But you need to hit as many of them as you possibly can. And I think from a priority standpoint, you need to make sure that you're making choices that are ethical in terms of making sure the individual has access to that basic human right of having being able to say what they want when they want. You need to make sure that you're choosing something that the individual that meets their needs and meets their needs in the future. And maybe that's not, depending on where they are, maybe that's not in the future when they're 40 and now they're 10. Maybe the future is the next 6 months to a year. And maybe you're balancing that with the other needs and other information that you're getting from the team based on the priorities that have been identified by the team. And that's okay.
And I think when we say you here, when we use that you pronoun, we are not talking, we're again going back to you as facilitator. So you are prioritizing, but you're really just facilitating the prioritization of these different areas through your conversations with the different stakeholders. So that is part of what you're doing when you're gathering that information. Part of why you're gathering all of that information is to help ask questions that help other people to sort out what their priorities actually are.
Yes, exactly.
So it's collective view.
Okay, so we've reviewed the interview. We've reviewed the more structured tools and the frameworks, the SET framework and the PESCO framework. We reviewed these guiding principles of things that you need to consider as a backdrop when you're thinking about your next steps. And now's the fun part. Your client is showing up tomorrow and you get to choose. You get to actually do the work. Now, I remember when I first started doing this, I was terrified. Do you remember what you said to me right before my first AAC eval? You probably don't even remember it.
I don't.
I was standing in the hallway and I had a client coming in. It was when we were at the hospital. And I had no idea what I was doing. I was like, I know this. I know how to program all these buttons. I've been talking with Amy. I have all this information, but I was terrified. I had no idea what I was doing. And you were like, just go in there and have fun. And I was like, oh, okay. I can do that.
Did you have fun?
So I can't remember. I must have had some fun because it's all I've been doing ever since for the last 12, 15 years, however long it's been. Okay, so this is the fun part. This is the part where you get to pick a couple tools and try them out. But you got to decide what you're going to choose and what you're going to try and why. And Amy and I went back and forth and had a little bit of discussion about this. There is this sort of standard or norm, at least in our geographical area, where you try 3 tools. You have to try at least 3 tools. Now, there are some Medicaid funding standards, or at least there used to be. And this is where this is where there's, knowledge that you need that we're not going to talk about today, that we will talk about in a future episode. But some of those standards might dictate exactly what you choose and why. So for example, here in Massachusetts, in an evaluation that you're writing for funding, meaning you're writing it for Medicaid funding or Mass Health, you have to include a cost analysis and you have to include specific reasons why you didn't use a paper-based tool, but why you think this $7,000 tool is the right tool. Mm-hmm. That might guide your decision-making. Okay, I am not really sure that this paper-based tool is the right choice, but I'm going to try it and take data on it so that I can present a better case in my documentation. So there's a little bit of give and take in this process in terms of what you consider to what choices you make when you pull those tools out of the tool cabinet.
And I think, this brings us to, I know we'll talk more about it in a future episode, but knowing your kind of the goal of your work environment, right? So when you're outpatient or in a medically based environment, you probably are more likely to be conducting an assessment for third-party funding. And, Kate mentioned some, state funded devices. You also might go through insurance. Everybody's insurance, if I know anything about health insurance, it's that it's complicated and confusing, and it's different depending upon your policy and your company, and there's all of these different variables. So you do kind of want to know that information, particularly if you know that the terminal outcome of this process is the expectation that you may be needing to have enough data and it's certain types of data in order to write a report for funding. So, when you're getting ready to go into that room, like Kate said, it is important that you have on your, if it were me, I would make a form for that to make sure that I, remember to do all of the things, right? A table, but exactly that, like you probably want to try something that is low tech. You probably want to try something that is mid tech. You may want to contrast a few different high tech tools, and that is to gather meaningful information about what's a good fit for your client, but also to gather information that will ultimately be required by your funding source if that's the case.
And I had some dusty knowledge in my brain about, this trying at least 3 tools in your assessment as some sort of Medicaid standard. I'm not sure if that's exactly true, but I do know that you cannot make an informed decision or recommendation if you try just one. You can't. That is bias. That is not informed decision making. That is not data-driven decision making. That is not good clinical decision making. You have to try multiple tools in an assessment to have and conduct a thorough and comprehensive and valid assessment.
And I
Agree?
I
Or
agree.
disagree?
I think one thing I have to throw out there, I think a huge challenge depending upon your environment is going to be those time constraints, because not only
Yes.
are you not making an informed decision if you put this one thing in front of a client and you try it this one time in this one moment in this one environment that probably is not even a customary environment for them. Perhaps you've never met them before. They've never been in this physical space with you before. All of these
Right.
things are new and different. That's not ultimately going to give you the information that you need, I don't think. Because another reason that we're doing this very thoughtful kind of gathering of all of this different information is because the other thing we don't want to do is make an inappropriate match and then have somebody have like very frustrating experiences that lead them to have, challenging emotional experience around using this tool. And that could be the communicator, that could be their partners, that could be all sorts of people who are involved in that process, or abandoning the tool, right? So you don't want to get somebody this thing and then it sits up on a shelf because it wasn't a great fit. So I do think part of what you're sorting through is not only like, what does this person do in this one moment, but kind of what might be my plan for them to use it on a longer term trial type of basis to gather more meaningful information.
Right. So let's say that you've taken all those things into consideration and you have a general understanding. You've listened to the future episode that we haven't even written or published yet about funding, and you have your background information and you're getting ready to like go into your cabinet and pull out a couple tools and decide which ones you're going to try and why. And this is where your device knowledge and equipment knowledge comes in, and what the feature matching process is really all about. So you spent an interview or file review, document review, learning all about your client, and you've identified and prioritized a handful of communicative needs. And you now get the fun part of matching them to the tools and products that you have available to you. You likely learned a lot about your clients' needs, and managing them and matching them is really important. So let's go through what the different needs are that you identified. So there's language status. What kind of language system is best suited to your client? And this is where you consider vocabulary size, iconicity.
I think connected with that, when we're thinking about language, we're also thinking about bilingual. Is this person somebody who's a dual language speaker or a multilingual person? Are they coming to us? What is their environment? At the moment, the number of options out there when we're thinking about high-tech tools is not great in terms
Right.
of dual language or multiple language options. I recently went to a virtual conference and sat on or listened to a panel of developers kind of talk about some of those challenges. I think a really heartening thing is that the creators of a lot of the different apps specifically know that it's an issue. But dialect is another thing. What are the voices that are available? So when we think about language, we're thinking, yes, about complexity of the actual system and how it's organized. Is it categorical? Is it driven by more of a motoric basis? At one other piece, if you've been in the field for long enough, I think we all have our preferred language organization, like language representation methods. And I think constantly being aware of your preferred language representation method and being sure that that is not preventing you from trying alternative language representation methods with your clients.
Yes, it's not about you. It's about your
you.
client.
Yeah.
And their communication partners and their values. Okay, so you've opened up the doors of your product cabinet and you're going to pick a couple out. You need to consider just recapping, you need to consider all of the things that go into their language status. You also need to consider motor and sensory access. So based on your observation, based on the information that you collected, based on your interview, what kind of access method do you think would be a good match? Some things to consider in terms of sensory and motor considerations. What are the visual and tactile considerations? Do you think direct selection is an appropriate access method? Or are you going to be considering a partner assisted scanning? I know what you're going to say. Go ahead.
I'm going to say, hopefully your OT or PT is in there with you if you identified any actual like access needs.
So if you have identified access needs, this is where interdisciplinary AAC evals are super, super important. And fun. It's really, really fun to collaborate with your OT and, TVI, other specialists to help give you the knowledge that you don't necessarily have when you're choosing your access system. And just to review just a handful of them. So if you're looking at a direct selection system, are they going to be using a distal point? Is it with their finger or a stylus? What about an eye gaze system? What does the visual display need to look like if it's an eye gaze system or not an eye gaze system? Maybe it's a combination of direct selection with customizations for the visual display. There are head pointers. If you're working with complex bodies, there are so many different kinds of activated switches, proximity switches, sip and puff switches. There are so many different products out there. And working closely with an OT to help you navigate some of these things is critical.
I think too, another thing to think about, when we think about kind of uncomplicated direct selection, right? So that's somebody who's physically accessing a high-tech device, just, similar to how we would be interacting with our touchscreens on our telephones or whatever. I think when we think about other access methods, including indirect access, like using switches and scanning and things like that, there's not only the component that our OT, PT colleagues bring to the table, which is around optimal body positioning and placement for these access methods, but also around kind of ergonomics. Not only do we want to make sure we're placing the switch in a place that is, again, like not going to be overly effortful or challenging, we also don't want to be setting our communicator up for repetitive stress injuries or something else. So it can't really be overstated enough, the importance of input from a broader team when you're looking at some of those modalities.
Okay, so I thought it would be a good exercise to walk our listeners through some examples here, since this is a very complex process. And I wanted to say, we tried to come up with some examples that were very, very simple, very concrete, just to give you a feel for what we mean by the feature matching process. So you've got all this information about your student or client. You've got all this information about the different products that are out there. How do you choose a tool and why? So let's say you have a client that has a diagnosis of a cortical visual impairment, and you had the chance to review the documentation from the teacher for the visually impaired, or you have maybe a functional visual assessment given to you by the family. And if you're really lucky, you have a teacher for the visually impaired available to you and on your team, and somebody that you can actually sit there and physically work with. In that report or through that process, you learn that high color contrast symbols are reported to be a successful visual support or a required feature. So when you open that toolbox, you're going to choose tools that have that feature. You are going to choose tools that have the option for high color contrast symbols.
And I think in Kate's example here, one thing that she does a really nice job pointing out is like, this would be,
thank you.
This would be a required feature. You might also find a couple of other things that the team has identified as would be nice. And sort of in my mind, when I'm looking through, as you're gathering all this information about your client, you kind of do sort of start to stratify, again, collaboratively through your conversations and reviews with other people, these things that are like not a choice and would be nice.
Right. So in that example, having high color contrast symbols is not a choice. You have to choose a tool that has that feature. Let's go on to another very concrete example. You have a client who has a history of sensory seeking, and historically they become very preoccupied with Velcro, and it becomes a total hurdle to communication. If you're going to choose a light tech paper system, you are going to choose one that does not have a Velcro feature. You are going to rule that out. And if you have heard from the team that it's a showstopper for communication, that's a requirement. And for me, I don't know if this is your experience, this feature matching process and what you pull out of the cabinet to physically try with the student or client ends up being a process of ruling things out. So in these examples, you rule everything out that doesn't have high color contrast symbols, or you rule everything out that has Velcro. And that's how you sort of narrow it down to the small handful of things that you think would be a good fit.
I think you're also ruling things in too. And you might find out, you're taking the information. I think you can also be a little bit smushy and flexible too. If you heard from the team, like, you know what, 2 years ago, he had this really hard time with Velcro. I don't know. You might bring it out and see, and then within a few minutes be like, oh yes, no, Velcro was still challenging. It doesn't mean you can't consider something. But yeah, you're ruling things in and out is as far as like what you're going to bring into that room with you. Probably Velcro is not going to be at the top of the list on that first day. If you try some other stuff and you're like, I don't know if any of these are quite right, that doesn't mean you might not circle back and revisit some of your other options.
I also want to say I had this conversation recently with another of my mentees. Failure is still data. So sometimes you're going to choose something that you don't think is going to work, and you're going to do it to either prove or disprove. So let's say that in this example of the Velcro, you really think that a PEX-like system or some sort of picture exchange system would be the best fit on all these other features, but you've got this Velcro problem. You might choose to try it to see. Maybe the last time it was tried, it was a couple of years ago. Maybe it was in a different environment. Maybe it's in conjunction with a behavior plan. Maybe, I don't know, maybe. You can still try things and knowing that it might not go well, and that is zero judgment on your clinical skills. Sometimes we do things for the information that it didn't go well. And sometimes knowing that it didn't go well and ruling a tool out is massively helpful through the evaluation process. I love that quote. Failure isn't failure. It is data. It is. And it's so true. And sometimes a big part of this process, because a lot of times, I mean, these examples we gave you are so straightforward, but a lot of our learners have very complex needs and they need customizations that are very outside of the box. So your evaluation process is, let's try a little bit of this. That part of that worked. Most of it was a disaster. Let's pepper in a little bit of that. And you carve this thing out of marble, so to speak, and create a customization to meet the needs of the individual user.
Yeah. I mean, I think another piece to consider is what are the problems? I use that. That's a set framework. That's Joy Zabala. But like, what are the problems that you're trying to solve? And there are also, it's a really different problem to try and solve for somebody who at the moment maybe doesn't have a symbolic communication system versus somebody who does, and maybe we're just exploring some other questions. I think it's really different to think about changing something that's been working and has been in place for a while. There's a difference between trying to solve an optimization problem versus an initial access problem. So there are a lot of things that go into what you're bringing into that room with you. And part of that is the person's history and what they have familiarity with. But prior failure, in air quotes, is also doesn't mean that it won't work again. I try a lot of things that didn't work before and we revisit them. It doesn't mean that this one time, if you tried this system, in preschool, that we're not going to consider that in perpetuity.
Right. Exactly. Okay. So I think we've laid the groundwork we've covered a lot of ground. We're going to move into our last learning objective. Identify at least 3 client considerations when conducting a comprehensive AAC assessment. So you thought about all the features that you need that are well matched to the client's strengths and areas of needs, and you're getting ready to sit in the chair. So you've chosen your tools, and now you're like, okay, Johnny's coming in a half an hour. You're freaking out in the hallway, and Amy's not there to tell you to just go have fun. But hopefully our voices are there encouraging you on. Okay, so you should consider collaboration. Now, hear me out for a second. Do you have a client that would benefit from the input of another professional? And do you have the opportunity to pull that professional in? Is there an OT that is going to be able to help you with sensory or motor or positioning? Is there a teacher for the visually impaired who is maybe going to give you some on the fly input? Okay, let's change this. Let's change that. Do you have access to a BCBA maybe to help you with implementation or a behavior plan around being available for learning through your assessment? There's a lot of things that might help if you have access to that collaboration. Now, we know that a lot of AAC evals happen in a vacuum. They happen in an outpatient setting. We were there. We did it. They happen in a vacuum, and a lot of people don't have access to that collaboration. But if you do, or if you have a colleague that you can call for some ideas and tweaks, because again, sometimes you plan for the best sessions and it doesn't go well and you're planning things on the fly. If you have access to possible collaboration, definitely consider using it. Consider motivation and reinforcement. So just like you plan for your speech therapy sessions and you plan super fun activities and you plan for an activity that's going to evoke some great communication and some great language, it's no different. Have fun. Plan to have fun. I think it's incredibly important. We want our AAC users first experience, if it's their first experience with an AAC in general or just a first experience with this particular tool, we want them to see this and engage with it and participate in it and be like, this is awesome.
And I don't think we said this, but this is another really important piece of information that you're trying to get through those interviews, observation, and record review. Like you want to know this information before you go into that room. You want to know, my client loves music. My client hates when you sing. Like you want to know those things going in so that not only are you bringing actual products and equipment with you, you're hopefully bringing activities or at least the ideas of activities, depending upon the age of your client, that are going to be meaningful and hopefully engaging for both of you.
Right. And I think this is where it really, differs from traditional speech and language assessments, because playing and engaging in communication with the new tool is the eval. And you need to take data and you need to, measure exactly what's happening and take note of all of these different variables that we'll talk about in a second. But a lot of the time it feels like diagnostic treatment, which I recently learned is a term that only people I know use.
What is the term some of the other people use?
Some people say dynamic assessment. And by some people, you know who you are. So I was taught diagnostic treatment. So you're doing a treatment session, but you're taking note of changes in measurement. Now, Amy, do you want to tell us the real words about the real words, dynamic assessment, and how dynamic assessment is often part of this assessment process?
If you want the real words, you guys should listen to our interview with Trina and Doug. However, when we're thinking about dynamic assessment, I think in the context of AAC specifically, you're also looking at the strategies. For me, I feel like the dynamic assessment component is also looking at, okay, well, if I do this, then what does that mean for you as the communicator? If I do this, does that seem to be supporting you? Does that seem to be inhibiting your communication? And when I say I do this, that could mean a strategy that I use like modeling or prompting. So providing like a structured, either increasing or decreasing level of support to the communicator and seeing kind of what that looks like. It could also mean if I modify the actual interface of the tool, right? So if I do this could mean, well, all right, when I showed you a full display of 60 or 84 buttons, then these strategies like modeling and providing prompts didn't seem to have the effect that I was hoping for in the interaction. So maybe what if I modify how it looks and make it a little bit more simplistic visually? What if I modify the number of buttons you need to push before you say a word, before the device speaks? So you're really looking at that dynamic assessment component of not only what are you doing, but what is the interplay between what I'm doing and what you do.
Right. And I think it's a really important, thing to consider that when you do that, that is the assessment, and you're doing it through a systematic and procedural way and measuring it as you do it.
Sorry, this is like a bitty soapbox that I'm just going to get up on real quick. But I think This is super important, right? So when we think about AAC assessments, we're really thinking about functional use. And so as much as possible, you want information about functional use.
Yes. Yes.
So while
All the
there are a
yes.
lot of tools out there, we mentioned some of them at the beginning, where you may, tell somebody to point to symbols and see if they can point to those symbols accurately or not. And that does give you some helpful information. That information doesn't tell you what it's going to look like functionally. And I think for a lot of people who are complex communicators, it also, just in this one moment with potentially a brand new person in a brand new physical space, doesn't necessarily tell you what that's going to look like over time as well. So you have to be very aware that while you're doing this dynamic assessment, what you're getting is a snapshot.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what that is. And that's helpful information, but it's still a snapshot.
Yes. And I think one last note on that is when you're choosing the activity is just to avoid work, just to, avoid drills. Think about what Amy said, and I'll just say it again. You are really interested in functional use. And that's not drilling. That's not repeating the same thing over and over again. You want to really try and take a snapshot of the individual using the tool in a functional way. Okay. Soapbox over. Let's move on. So you've planned your activity, you've got your tools, and you need to consider both access and language while you're in there on the floor, at the table, wherever it is that you are. You need to take note of your client's sensory and motor needs, and you need to make adjustments to it as needed. So as you tweak things, let's say you've changed the dwell time on the screen, or you've changed the positioning of a switch, or you've placed the visual materials in a different visual field, make note of it so that you can keep track of what changes based on those small tweaks, because it's all information that you are going to need when you write up your report, which is going to be 7,000 pages long. I'm just teasing. We'll get into that in a future episode, but make sure that your data collection skills and your tracking skills are available to you so that you can make note of the small tweaks that you make and the changes and the impact that it has on your client's functional use. Make note of what intervention strategies you're using and which ones are successful and which ones aren't successful. So like Amy said, what kind of prompting are you using? Is it successful or not successful? Are you using errorless learning or contextual cues or gesture prompts or modeling? Which one of those was more or less successful as you went through the assessment? Where are you conducting the assessment? Are you in a quiet room? Are you in a busy classroom? Do you have the opportunity to try them in two places? If you're in a sterile outpatient environment, how can you get information about using it in a more functional environment? Again, remember, you're the facilitator. You're doing this assessment so that the person has access to their basic human rights to communicate in a functional place. Likely your client, your treatment room is not a functional place for that individual. So how are you going to problem solve that and get access to that information? Your time, your schedule, and whatever, workplace setting you're in is going to dictate this a lot. But the questions that you're trying to answer might dictate where and how you trial your materials. Consider the client's preference and their values. So is there a tool that your client prefers? This is really important. Is there a tool that your client prefers? Remember that the evidence-based practice triangle, that triangle, if you're not familiar with it, go back to one of our previous episodes or Google ASHA EBP triangle. One of the arms of that triangle is client and caregiver perspectives. So considering their perspectives is evidence-based practice. That doesn't mean that you just do what the grandparents have asked you to do, but you need to take it into consideration and know that in doing so, you are providing evidence-based practice. If you don't know, ask them. If they don't quite have the communication skills to indicate this to you with language, meaning your client, put the tools out in front of them, all the tools that you tried, and see which one they gravitate towards. Use contextual cues to feel out what their preference is. Are they making a gesture towards one of the tools that you tried? Or are they actually using one of the tools that you tried over the other tools? This is a really, really important piece.
And I think this can't be overstated. So we're just going to say it again. Is there a tool that your client or their primary communication partners prefer? I think along with this, sort of the flip side of this is new things are sometimes hard, and sometimes, especially when we're thinking about more robust language systems, sometimes the thing that appears simplest and easiest at first ends up being quite limiting in the future. So this is where I am, a broken record as far as conducting more lengthy trials. Sometimes you want to compare a few things for a while and let the person get a little bit of learning under their belt and just have a conversation. Hey, we're going to try this for a few weeks. You don't have to try it forever, but I want you to have enough opportunity to really learn how to use the system so you can make an informed choice. So I think that's just the other piece there.
And I only have two more things to say before we wrap up in this episode, but I think at least one of them is important. The first one is be prepared to fly by the seat of your pants. Mm-hmm. So you can plan and prepare with the best tool and have gone through this entire process. We've been talking for an hour and a half. And within 5 minutes, you could learn that everything you planned and prepared is not going well. So you need to be prepared to adjust and tweak as you move forward. It happens in all therapy. I personally have found that it's particularly true in AAC evaluations. That was one thing. The second thing, and the last thing I'll say before we wrap up, is something that Amy already touched on: the trial. Yeah. The trial. Yeah. Please do not make final recommendations for a tool after one session. The data-driven trial is required by some funding sources, which we will get into in another episode. But if it is not required, it is still best practice. Please do not, I'm being so authoritative here. I feel very passionate about this all of a sudden. Making final recommendations about a tool without a data-driven trial does not give your AAC user, or client, or student an opportunity to use the tool functionally, learn to use the tool functionally, and prove that it is actually a good fit for their communication needs.
Yes. 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 I agree. I agree so much with that. And I think, oftentimes, I don't know what your experience is like, Kate, but I feel like oftentimes it's a trial of not just one thing either. It's not just, oh, I tried this one thing and yes, it's good. It may look more like I tried these two things, or I tried this one thing in two different ways. And then you can actually make a comparison as well. And it gives your client and their caregivers a chance to make a comparison too. Because if you just try one kind of chocolate, you don't know if that's your favorite kind of chocolate or not.
Exactly. Not only that, but I think, to me, there's an ethical component to this, because if you make a recommendation for purchase for a purchase of an item without a data-driven trial, then you are potentially wasting someone's resources, which is, I think, a really important thing to consider. And notice that I'm saying data-driven trial. And I heard someone say recently, don't bother taking data. Just take a video of the part of the individual and describe what it is that they're doing. And I just want to say that is also data. So data is not necessarily checking pluses and minuses in a bunch of trials. You need to have some measurement system through the course of the trial to build the case that the tool you have chosen is in fact well matched to their needs. This is also going to really help the individual fight against device abandonment. It gives the family and caregivers an opportunity to familiarize themselves with the tool, to provide input on how it's going at home or what their concerns are. You have so much more opportunity to do that through a trial instead of an hour and a half or an hour evaluation, no matter what your work setting is. So again, consider the importance of the trial. Please do a data-driven trial. That is all I will say.
Until next time.
Until next time. So we know that this was a lot. If you have questions, please reach out to us. Again, we are going to have a handout that lists all this information on our website that you can download. We know that it's a lot. We know that it's complicated. And it takes a while to get this within your scope of practice and feel more comfortable with it. And we've been there. So if you do have additional questions or are seeking some more support, please don't hesitate to reach out to us anytime. You can use this episode for ASHA CEUs. Just cruise on over to our website to take the quiz. And thank you so much for joining us.